Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Today's episode is a clip show. Yes, the dreaded clip show. Don't have a new episode for you at the moment, so you're going to get some highlights from some of my favorite moments from past episodes of the Catholic Culture Podcast and a little bit of another podcast that I host, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. Rather than introducing these clips individually as they come up, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what you'll be hearing in the episode, and then I'm just going to let the clips play. So you'll be hearing from 3 episodes, and I'll link to all of these full episodes in the show notes in case you want to check out the entire episode. So from the Catholic Culture Podcast, episode 61, Liberal Anti-Culture versus the Western Vision of the Soul, part 1. Now that is the first of 3 episodes with James Matthew Wilson, the poet and philosopher, about his excellent modern classic book, The Vision of the Soul. And it's a great philosophical, aesthetic deep dive. In the clips you'll hear from this first part, will cover why it's a mistake to associate artistic beauty with cultural liberalism, why modern thinkers have been driven to portray reality as less interesting than it seems, to deconstruct the wonder of reality, and what James calls the 6 fundamental insights of the Western tradition. Another episode from the Catholic Culture Podcast, you'll be hearing excerpts from episode 67, Why I'm No Longer a Catholic Feminist, with Melody Lyons. Pretty self-explanatory title. Obviously, she's referring to no longer being a feminist, that part, not that she's no longer a Catholic, which she obviously still is, as you'll tell from hearing the clips. And from that, you'll hear Melody talk about being raised in a feminist household, the spiritual elements of feminism, how she was helped to get away from feminism by the thought of John Paul II about women, how feminists have attempted in some ways to co-opt the pro-life movement and make it all about feminism, the misguided attempt to find common ground with secular feminists by using the feminist label, and why it might actually be counterproductive, even if you're completely an Orthodox Catholic, to use that label with the best of intentions, and how men can positively influence the women in their lives. The other episode you'll be hearing a little bit from is, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was the second film discussion we ever did, James Majewski and I, on Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, and we were going through the whole Vatican film list, which came out in 1995, and went through the whole thing by now. We actually completed that project after about 3 years. This episode was called Robots Don't Matter, and the film being discussed was 2001, A Space Odyssey. And one of the reasons that I decided to include some clips from this is that we're talking about AI, which is obviously one of the themes of the film. And I kind of talk about why I don't often find AI a very interesting theme in films, because people make more of it than it's possible, ontologically, metaphysically. And this is all very relevant with, all of the obsession with AI and the age of ChatGPT and all of this stuff. But we also talk about how 2001 actually does a better and more interesting job dealing with the topic of AI than many other films have. So yeah, that's an overview of what you'll be hearing about in this episode. There's some spicy takes in this one, and I'll be alternating back and forth between the episodes, so it won't be all of the clips from one episode, then all the clips from the next episode. I'll sort of be going back and forth, but they won't really need introductions because the clips kind of speak for themselves. So that's all by way of introduction. I hope you enjoy this little trip down memory lane here, or maybe discovering these for the first time if you haven't listened to it before. I like to think some of my older material still holds up now. So I'll be working on a new episode for you soon enough, and I hope you enjoy this one. Before that, at the beginning of the book, you make some points as to why it's a mistake that we commonly associate cultural and artistic vitality with liberalism. So why don't we actually start there?
Sure. Yeah, that was one of the genesis moments of writing this book, was contemplating what the Western tradition as a whole looks like and has to teach us. And what it has to teach us primarily can really be kind of summed up by Plato in the Republic. Most people are content with a fairly shallow vision of the world, that life, that reality as such is just a series of shadows, a series of appearances. But in fact, even a few moments rational reflection compels us to recognize that a shadow has to be projected from something, that whatever appears to us is but the appearance of a deeper and richer whole. And so a full knowledge of the truth will transcend appearances or go more deeply into them until it reaches what's beyond them. And a rich form of human life will be a life spent in contact with reality in its fullness, not just with the superficial. This is just the West tradition as a whole. And it's not the exclusive property of the West, because at its foundation is just the acknowledgement that reality is truth, that truth are one, that truth is a whole that contains many truths, but they're all held together in a single coherent order and form, and that the human person by nature is destined to know the truth. So every culture is the practice of people learning how to discern the truth and to respond to it, to form the world in accordance with that truth. About 200 years ago, you begin to see a stirring that associates the arts and the beautiful, and indeed culture as a whole, with disintegrative rather than unitive forces, with decultivating forces rather than cultivating forces. So culture begins to become an anti-culture. And when did that happen? Really, that happened with the French Revolution. Great though that was as a political event, it's always been, in a certain sense, especially for English speakers, overshadowed for what it meant as an intellectual event. It was the first moment where the idea of intelligence, the idea of common sense, or of speaking the truth, was used to actually tear down rather than build up a civilization. And from that moment, a new kind of perverse tradition comes into our culture that didn't exist before. One that's commonly described just as liberalism. What does liberalism do as it begins to mature? Well, liberalism is that ideology that says there are only two things that we can approve as goods that must be pursued. And those two things are freedom and equality. So if you look over the last 200 years of political thought, you'll come across figures, really important figures like Alexis de Tocqueville, who are thinking through what it means to be in political society, largely in terms of freedom and equality. And can these two things coexist? But they don't necessarily call into question those as sort of the foundational terms of political life. That's actually very dangerous. We all acknowledge that being free is good, at least insofar as freedom stands in opposition to some kind of slavish servitude or imprisonment. We all acknowledge that equality is good, insofar as equality means the treating as like that which is actually like. But liberalism didn't propose that the like should be treated as the like, or that freedom was just a good thing in relative speaking to some kind of captivity or servitude. What it proposed is two mutually exclusive ideas: that freedom was an absolute good, so that every form that limits freedom is intrinsically an injustice. But of course, if everybody were radically free in the sense of simply being ungoverned, unformed, unconfined, unattached, then nobody would be equal. Somebody would be oppressing somebody else just in the pure freedom state, pure condition of ungovernedness. Equality, similarly, can hardly be an absolute good, because though we want the like to be treated as the like, we don't want irrelevant differences to conceal from us fundamental similarities. Nobody thinks that simply being treated equal, which is pretty much a negative good in the sense that it's not something good in itself. It's like recovering from an illness. You don't want to be ill, but you don't think of health as simply the highest good that you could ever have in your life. So it is with equality. We want equality where it seems appropriate, but equality as the one definite good after which all civilization sets out as if it were its last, final, and most important quest, that's very empty. So liberalism is just that political philosophy that absolutizes two relative goods, making them the only goods. It's an incoherent ideology because those two things are mutually exclusive, as I said, but it's also a dangerous one because once you're free, you're forced to ask the question that John Paul II proposed to us. Free for what? And if everybody's absolutely equal, so that there's no difference between anyone, if everybody's equal such that everything just seems like a great, vast plane of sameness, or to use T.S. Eliot's old words, that it all seems like protoplasm, that one thing's the same as the other, and we're just in a sort of primordial soup of sameness, what would be the point of that? What's the positive good of that? So liberalism could sustain itself as a kind of ideology for a while that had its arts of freedom and its arts of equality, its works of art that said, we're moving towards freedom, we're moving towards equality. But at some point, it emerged and realized these are not absolute goods. And so there's really been no point to our activity. What would a novel look like? What would a poem look like that just described freedom as the mere absence of oppression? So my argument is that this emergence of an ideology of the French Revolution certainly made the appearance of being a kind of defensive culture. It was active and dynamic, and it proposed as good two clearly definable things, freedom and equality. But in fact, it was vacuous from the beginning. It was nihilistic from the beginning. And what it really did was sought to tear down every edifice that had ever been constructed in order to help human beings become more adequate to the knowledge of what was true, what was good, and what was beautiful. If that's the case, and here I'll end with this, if that's the case, then the first great conservative, Edmund Burke, was the first person to stand in defense of the transcendental properties of being, of truth, goodness, and beauty, against this kind of nihilistic ideology. And he's therefore the great defender of not just a counter-revolutionary past or a pre-revolutionary past. He's the great defender of the whole tradition that our ancestors worked with great difficulty to build up in the first place.
And we'll talk about him in a moment as the sort of founding figure of conservatism. You know, it's interesting. You said, like, what does a novel look like with sort of freedom and equality as core principles? And, you know, there's many, many reasons why modern stories tend to be sort of stuck in darkness and depravity. And one reason for that, though, may be that you need to have sort of conflict without resolution in order to distract from the fact that once you get where you want to be, it's not very interesting. You know, freedom and equality as defined, you know, in modernity are not that interesting. You know, I don't think that you could have a sort of really beautiful depiction of those things. So all we have are characters who lack those things and are striving for those things. But, you know, if they ever got them, I think that it wouldn't be a very fulfilling ending.
Years ago, I used to read a clever magazine called The Baffler, and it had a wonderful article that pointed out that though old curmudgeons sitting on the front porch shaking their fists at the irreverent young have long since faded from history, you can't have, as it were, a Mountain Dew commercial that shows young irreverent surfers who are, you know, enjoying their action beverage, without the commercial also having this old crusty person who disapproves, even though that person doesn't exist. The rebellion of absolute freedom, or freedom for its own sake, doesn't look interesting if there's no enemy that's being rebelled against. And you would think, well, this is just a clever strategy of, you know, advertising the executives for Pepsi. But if you consider some of the arguments that, say, Rusty Reno has been making the pages of First Things the last couple of years, you realize how actually deep this goes into our culture. As universities and corporations devote ever greater resources to diversity offices, they feel a sort of complementary obligation to be ever more attentive to policing every possible sign of discrimination. Why? Well, because they have to justify the existence of the diversity office. So there has to be inveterate racists or anti-Semites or sexists or harassers or so on and so forth crawling on every campus so as to justify the existence of these administrators. And then you say, well, why would a university want this extra bloat that they have? Well, it's not really clear in our day what most universities are doing, because they've long since given up the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty on average. they have remolded themselves as essentially liberal institutions, institutions that are designed to engineer freedom and equality. And so the very university's self understanding requires that it be serving in a benighted, racist, sexist society so that university presidents and the administrations that they govern will have some justification for their own existence. To put it really briefly, they're kind of saying, well, we don't have anything true to teach people, but we can definitely help people to engage in a kind of discernment of conscience to ferret out their unconscious microaggressions and racism. And, you know, that's a new priesthood, and it justifies it helps them to sleep at night and to justify their multi-billion-dollar budgets.
You were raised as a feminist, is that right?
I was, yes. I was raised in a divorced household. And my mom, I'm not saying anything, by the way, that she wouldn't say herself. So it's not like I'm, dishing on my family. But she was very specifically feminist. And she talked often about feminist activism. So I knew the heroes and I knew the lingo. And to be honest, nothing in the culture really bumped up against that in a bad way. Like it was all just consistent. The messages I got at school didn't tell me that anything that I was learning was wrong, nothing in the culture. So it really just was kind of seamless. It's just that in my household, there was more of an activist mindset about it.
Okay, so am I right? Did I hear you say that you had family members involved in the occult as well?
Yes. And, I don't really want to talk too much like in depth about people, but absolutely. And I was also pretty deeply involved myself. So,
and was that linked to the feminism?
I think it's all linked. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand is that when you get off the path and you start replacing Christ and the gospel with anything else, and you do it with fervor, it remains activism, but it necessarily takes on a spiritual component as well. And what I've seen from feminism and even from the Catholic left is that all of these things kind of converge and they either are rooted, come from the same root or they lead there. And I don't know if that's confusing or not, but.
No. Well, that kind of leads us to one of your first points in the article is that feminism is not just a political movement. It is inevitably a spiritual disposition.
Absolutely.
So is that something you can expand on?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it is by and large, the movement is without Christ, anti-Christ. And whether somebody would call themselves an anti-Christian or not, that's the reality. You're replacing the fatherhood of God and the sovereignty of Jesus Christ with something other. And so it's really, it becomes very self-focused, very much about self-preservation, this maintaining this sense of offense and a sense of like constant injustice being perpetuated. The mindset necessarily like leads to a place of anger, bitterness, and ingratitude. And that's just the death knell of the soul. You can't stay there and continue to thrive in peace and joy. And I think the more that feminism beats that drum of that anger that they consider righteous, but really turns quickly into like an unholy rage, the further away from Christ it gets. And that's really where it just starts to degenerate into a whole spiritual mess.
You mentioned encountering the teachings of John Paul II.
Yes, very influential.
Yeah. So how did that help you?
So that was after my conversion. I was already practicing the faith and actually married. And I sometimes quip, though I'm not sure, it's really a joke that his teaching sort of saved my marriage at the very beginning. We weren't in trouble, but I think, there may have been down the road if I never really had an understanding or was never really able to like discard those last bits of feminism that were really had a grip on my mind. And so reading his work on the dignity and vocation of women was just a huge milestone. It just opened the door to so much healing and restoration. And I just read it and I felt like these scales just fell and I just wept and wept. And I'm like, this is me. This is who I am. I had never seen womanhood described the way that he did. And it was just mind blowing. That's all I can say. It just blew open my mind, my heart. And it just, as I wrote in the article, I just fell deeply into this joy, grace, and peace that I had never known.
Can you name anything specific that he said about sort of a woman's vocation that kind of replaced your old conception and really struck you at that time?
Yeah, the one thing that I always take with me, it's never left me, is the phrase to serve is to reign. And up until that point, I had been, the I am woman, hear me roar. And it just sort of this spirit of defiance, which I'm sure is a spiritual thing, this kind of oppression from my involvement with feminism, but also, with the occult. And, that phrase, I wrote it all over everything on my notebooks and, at work and everything. And it was a freedom. It released me from the need to be in control, to be in charge of everything, you know, to sort of be an activist for my life. And instead, I was able to rest in Christ, to allow Him to lift me up instead of this constant climbing and this constant anger and tension, and to just settle into my vocation, which I had not understood prior to that.
That's beautiful. So now, many years later, you haven't used the term feminist to describe yourself in any sense for a long period, and then you picked it up again. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. That was interesting because I was really reluctant for a long, long time. And I was heavily influenced by the very good work of some women in the church. I saw what they were doing. They were talking about a new feminism, one that revealed the light of humana vitae and was consistent with my Christian understanding of womanhood, like an honoring of the body, not this fighting against the body or disrupting it, but an honoring of the body, helping women to understand their beautiful biology in the context of the relationships and the whole world, and to have this reverence. And from that reverence stems this desire to do the right thing and to follow natural law, and to reject abortion, reject contraception. And I loved that. It was so powerful. And so I did decide, you know what? I believe what they're saying. I'm reading what they're writing and it makes so much sense. I can get on board with that. And so I did. And, I was pretty reluctant because I know how I felt about feminism, and I pretty much thought that everybody else would misunderstand what I meant by feminism. And I never really lost that. I don't think there was any point at which I was like super confident about using the term, but I did pick it up and I did give it a try for a while.
So we should probably address the question of, a lot of the justification for this term of the new feminism or Catholic feminism comes from St. John Paul II using this or calling for this
Mm-hmm.
in some sense. How did you take his, very rare, once or twice he used the term,
Right.
but how did you take his use of the term?
I never misunderstood him to be calling for like a literal movement of Catholic feminists. Even from the very beginning, when I read it, it was just very clear to me that he was calling for a renewal, an antidote, and a return to the heart of the gospel, and sort of saying, we need to move away, opposite to what's happening with this feminism. And I think that the context was just much broader than some people took it to mean. He wasn't saying, start this whole new movement. Let's, supplant the gospel, but he was illuminating it. And I never had this sense that we were just supposed to like become feminist, Catholic feminist activists. And I don't think there's anywhere where he really says that either. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I can understand how it was potentially misunderstood and has been misunderstood.
Yes.
But if I said, this is going to be a really stupid example, but I'm not good at examples. But if I said, like, we need a Catholic blitzkrieg to, fight the forces of evil, I would be probably talking about like, saying the rosary or something,
Right.
and not actually, having Catholics driving tanks.
I actually really like I like
know
that
that's a really
example.
incredibly dumb example, but
No,
that's
I
just a
actually
personal
really like
opinion.
it because Blitzkrieg kind of reminds me of what feminism does. So
Yeah.
it's just an all out, No, that's good. And I would agree with that. It was not telling us to start like this new thing within the church.
Or to sort of adopt a secular movement and adapt it to
Yes.
Catholicism somehow.
Right.
Because to give them credit, that the sort of new generation of Catholic feminists, a lot of them, not all of them, unlike the old guard, have at least started out trying to, for example, have a feminism that accepts the church's teachings on abortion or contraception, for example, or is somewhat complementarian, but it always seems to go further as time goes on in the direction of secular feminism.
It does. It seems it's almost inevitable. And like your example with pro-life, it's really interesting. Somebody commented to me recently saying during the March for Life, saying that she had to stop following several influencers because she found it so disturbing that they couldn't just discuss abortion and the beauty of life. It had to be this political activist statement, and all of them were, getting onto their social media accounts and saying, "Well, what about the border babies and the, and
Right.
like that consistent ethic of life, which they just feel this constant need to sort of suppress, the common pro-life discussion of abortion and elevate all these other things, which of course we take very, very seriously. But it's odd during the march, to be sort of saying, stop talking about the babies. Let's talk about everybody.
Right. It's very interesting, especially in this context, because the line that you hear, actually, many of these people repeating, which they've essentially picked up from people who are attacking the pro-life movement, is that, you can't just be anti-abortion, you have to be, pro all these other things, and that, it's just kind of a legalistic thing to just be anti-abortion. And yet they seem to fall into that same trap. Now, again, this is not true of everybody, but I often see in the sort of like pro-life feminist movement or the Catholic feminist movement even, they will defend church teachings, but they start to do it on secular grounds.
Right.
So for example, I was just looking into Audrey Assad earlier today
Ah,
because I became aware that she had been influenced by Richard Rohr and that she had sort of like in the past few years made some very sort of un-Catholic statements. So I looked at an interview with her. She's a popular Catholic singer-songwriter, for those who don't know her. And, they were asking her to, what do you think about contraception now? And she basically like wouldn't give a strong affirmation of any of the teachings of the church. And insofar as she did affirm them, it was always on secular ideological grounds. So in the case of contraception, the first thing she said was like, I still have to think about it, but like it does strike me that the origins of contraception are very patriarchal and even anti-feminist. So that was her grounds
interesting.
for opposing contraception. And that kind of goes in with my theory that feminism is a spirit as much as anything else. In other words, even if you're holding on to uh, certain sort of surface level teachings of the church on abortion and so forth, your reason for it gets replaced with this worldly thinking, which eventually erodes the teaching itself.
Absolutely. One interesting development has been this creation of like the new pro-life movement. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's definitely a feminist organization. It was created by a feminist and it contains all of it. That spirit is in there. It's angry, it's divisive, it's attacking. It really, in spite of its claim to be all encompassing, it really is, you can see over time it's a dismantling. It's regressing. And, the people involved were ostensibly Catholic and definitely influenced a lot of people. The founder was employed by Franciscan University and has been at the center of like the huge firestorm. But everybody, like so many women, kept following her and kept allowing her to influence them and
Are you
kept
talking
this.
about Rebecca Bratton Weiss, or is this someone
Absolutely.
else?
Yes, absolutely.
You point out throughout the book the development of what the modern intellectual has become. One of the things that you mentioned early on is that starting maybe with Hobbes, intellectuals, philosophers started wanting the world to be less interesting, not more. Everything is a kind of debunking and unveiling of kind of an emptiness. And this starts, long before Marxism or postmodernism, actually.
Yes, indeed. Great 20th century philosopher Iredell Jenkins, not much remembered, but for a handful of articles, very worthy of our memory. Jenkins published, I think during the Second World War, a very important article called The Postulate of an Impoverished Reality. Jenkins' argument was that all the apparent differences between different schools of modern thought, and he gives as an example Hobbes and Locke as a sort of empiricist school of modern philosophy, and then René Descartes as the quintessential rationalist or logicist school of modern philosophy. Says all these differences are irrelevant in comparison with what virtually every modern thinker has in common. Each modern thinker, virtually every characteristically modern thinker, begins with a postulate that reality is less in itself than it appears in experience. So I began by talking about Plato's Republic. Life on the surface of things just looks like a series of appearances. It looks very superficial, but if we engage in philosophical reason, we will go deeper and go beyond appearances into the depths and the riches of reality, which of course Plato describes not as depths, but as heights. We'll leave the cave of shadows and come out into the light of the sun and ascend from there to the highest reaches of being, from, in fact, becoming to the realm of being, from a place of images to a place where the genuine good is situate. Modern thinking says just the opposite. It's all modeled on Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, as it were, where the farther you go into reality, the more likely you are to, the more inclined you become to just crying out the horror that what appears good at first is in fact deeply impoverished, is empty in reality. And so I proposed that we have to stand athwart, that the conservative is one who stands athwart both the political destruction of modern liberal ideology, but also the more profound and earlier destruction of these various schools of modern thought that have all in common this postulate of the impoverished reality, and try to recover a vision of being where we see that everything, insofar as it's real, is true, is good, and is beautiful. Why? Well, nobody does anything except in pursuit of some good. We're surrounded, we're swarming, each of us, with all kinds of persons and things and ideas that are proposing themselves to us as good. So nobody doubts that, in at least one manner of speaking, that things are good. What we do doubt amid this sort of phantasmagoria is the possibility of there being any one good for which you should live your life. So the first thing I had to do was to recover a vision of the good, that human beings are called to some particular end, just as every other item in the world is clearly called to some particular end. We know what a tree looks like when it's functioning well, when it's doing what trees do the right way, and we know when a tree is sick. We know the same with animals. We know the same with household appliances like toasters and microwaves. We know when they're working and when they're not. For some reason, modern thought has introduced the possibility that human beings are the exception amid this great land of things that that perform their own good, that human beings have no particular good. Or if there is a good, it's the vacuous good of just to be free and to be equal. Free for what? Equal to what? So the first thing that I had to recover was the Western tradition's vision of the human good, that human beings are called to the contemplation of truth, goodness, and beauty, and through those three transcendentals are called to communion with God. Once we establish that, then we move from goodness to beauty and on to truth.
So what did you think about 2001?
Well, okay, so this wasn't the first time I've seen this film. It is a bit of a personal favorite of mine. It was the very first Blu-ray that I ever purchased back in, I don't know, like 2007 or something. I forget when Blu-rays really started to come onto the scene, but I remember thinking, oh man, 2001: A Space Odyssey in Blu-ray? Now, that's a Blu-ray I gotta own, you know? So I guess, you know, I have some sort of affection for it because of that. But also because it's a movie that I remember from, you know, if not my childhood, at least my sort of young adolescence. My father, I kind of credit my father with being my first introduction into the world of, let's call it, more demanding cinema. He was a big fan of Akira Kurosawa, for instance. So he had all these samurai black and white films, that I would see him watching as a child and sort of be just dumbfounded that he could watch a film in another language other than English and find it even remotely interesting. But then he also, I remember, had 2001: A Space Odyssey and Solaris. And Solaris is a film by Tarkovsky that, for our listeners who are not familiar, is, similar to 2001: Space Odyssey in some respects, in that it's a science fiction film, but it's also very slow paced.
Right,
So
right.
I remember watching Solaris as a child, or attempting to rather, and just being just out of my mind bored. I couldn't even believe it. And, I thought to myself, what does my father see in this? And I kind of credit that with being the first, sort of instructional moment, just knowing that there was something here that I wasn't seeing and that my father was. And so, that's sort of, I guess, the beginning for me of beginning to look at film with a sharper eye.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So with 2001: A Space Odyssey, I was able to watch that film and make it all the way through, as opposed to Solaris, where I couldn't. But with 2001, I could, and I was very proud of this. And frankly, I still am.
I rewatched the Matrix movies, and the first one definitely holds up, even though I don't think it makes very much sense. And then that got me thinking about the 1995 anime film Ghost in the Shell, which was a big influence on The Matrix. Ghost in the Shell deals with stuff about AI, which I don't find interesting, but it also has other futuristic themes, which I do find interesting, that it deals with more substantially, I think, than The Matrix does, such as the problem of how do you retain your identity if you replace your body almost entirely with cybernetics?
Yeah.
That's
whether
cool. The soul could somehow be transferred into a mostly robotic body or remain in it rather. So that stuff is super compelling. I'll be honest, I find the whole topic of artificial intelligence holds no interest for me. I can enjoy a character that's an AI, and I just forget that it's supposed to be a computer. Agent Smith in The Matrix is a great character. Hal in 2001, which we'll be discussing today, is a great character, but I don't find it philosophically interesting that they're computers.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think that especially in more recent films dealing with the theme of artificial intelligence, they're just so philosophically scattershot that they're utterly uncompelling. A lot of the problems that are identified are just problems that don't keep me up at night, about sort of emergent consciousness and ridiculous stuff like this. But I think that 2001 handles those questions a lot more compellingly than most, and I'll be interested to hear what you think about that, Thomas. But
sure,
I think that this film was probably, for me, my first encounter with those kinds of questions of AI, as it probably was for a lot of movie watchers, when it originally came out in 1968 and since. But I think it remains kind of one of the most haunting. It's cool that you watched Matrix and Ghost in the Shell, because that's very resonant with things going on in this film.
So Hal is a great character. I mean, the voice is everything, right, for Hal, and the voice is perfect, and it's clearly influenced, our series and, things like that as time has gone on. But it has this tone of complete quiet confidence.
Yeah.
I don't know how you describe it, but just everything's completely under control. It's kind of a reflective tone, but I don't know. Yeah, it's
no,
just
you're
it's
totally
a great
right.
Voice.
You're totally right. It's perfect, because it's haunting yet reassuring at the same time.
Right.
It can be comforting and terrifying, and also, it has this artificial quality that goes beyond, a staid robotic voice.
Right.
It's artificial even in its seeming to be human, in the obvious effort that has been put into programming this thing to sound human,
Right.
that sounds artificial, and so it's like, it is a great voice. You wonder,
and it has a certain charm to it. I mean, when you see the rapport that he has with the crew
right
at the beginning, and it's almost likable.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe this is a good time to just talk about how 2001 handles this theme of artificial intelligence that's kind of a popular theme nowadays, and one at which I roll my eyes most of the time because I'm just totally uninterested in the metaphysically impossible. Like, I'm down with fantasy, I'm down with sci-fi, but I want it to unfold within the sort of metaphysically possible, because otherwise it doesn't have anything to tell me about reality. Right. And I think that that's what makes sci-fi and fantasy interesting, is that they have something to tell us.
Let's just specify what we're talking about is the idea of artificial intelligence as being, something equal to or surpassing human intelligence, not, whatever problems could arise as a result of what we now call artificial intelligence, as we have it today, for example. There's all sorts of interesting things you could talk about with artificial intelligence on a historical level, on the level of, what you were saying before about humans giving up their prerogative of making judgments and things like that. But we're specifically talking about the idea of artificial intelligence as an actual intelligence.
Right. As an emergent, like, free will and feeling and self-awareness. These are all just dumb questions because they're impossible. Right. And I don't care how sort of, fancy your artificial intelligence gets. I don't care how fabricated or how, like, ornamented and intricate you're able to make it. It's still an elaborate mimicry. And there's
That's interesting. When don't they say that at the beginning? They make a point of the word that they use to describe.
Right. I was just about to say there's a nod to that in the sort of BBC World Tonight interview where he says something about how supercomputer is able to reproduce, some would say mimic, human intelligence. So it's like, this distinction between reproducing or mimicking human intelligence.
Right.
And whereas I totally roll my eyes at movies that sort of depend upon the idea that this could actually happen. I'll mention the most recent season of Black Mirror, like a garbage season from what I could tell just by watching the first episode with Miley Cyrus in it. It's handled more interestingly in 2001 because I think that everything that Hal does, it never requires me to believe that Hal has developed free will or intelligence or, self-awareness or consciousness. Maybe I'm not correct in thinking this.
Some people have argued that Hal goes insane because he is ordered to deceive the crew or withhold information for them, and this introduces some kind of conflict into its programming or something like that. There's a debate over what exactly is the behind Hal's actions in the film.
Right, and I don't pretend to know exactly why Hal, deteriorates the way that he does, but I don't feel the need to explain it with this sort of like deus ex machina, like emergent intelligence. I totally see there still being space for, arguing about like what is it specifically that causes him to kind of malfunction in this way. But I find the malfunctioning totally believable and all the more sinister for it, because I don't find, stories about robots or AI very sinister or terrifying if, in order for them to become, oppressive, they first have to develop intelligence. It's like, okay, well, that's never going to happen, so I don't need to worry about that. But if it can become oppressive, become inhuman and murderous even without having to sort of develop its own intelligence, if it can still be operating, as a machine, as an artificial intelligence, but one that suddenly turns on its maker, like, then that is really sinister and terrifying. And I think that that's what's going on here. I mean, I guess the one thing that I will point to that maybe speaks, against this is Well, it's the interviewer actually in that BBC segment mentions it as well when he says, I detected a hint of pride in his response to me about his perfection and accuracy. It's true, like we heard his response there and we can see that, yeah, there's kind of like a hint of pride there. But then Dr. Bowman says, well, he's programmed to seem to have emotions because it makes it easier for us to talk with him. Well, that kind of plays out again later, I think, in this really excellent way when Dr. Bowman is returning to the ship after trying to rescue Dr. Frank Poole. And, he says, open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. And there's no response. And then he says it again, open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. And he says it a few more times. And he says, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal? No response until finally Hal says, affirmative, Dave. I read you. And it's like, whoa, like, why did he not respond for that long, only to respond, if not for pride? Do you know what I mean, Thomas? Like, why would he respond if not because of pride? Because
because a computer doesn't really, I wouldn't think a computer responds to badgering per se.
Right.
You know
totally.
what I mean?
Totally,
It would do it completely
him.
rationally. It wouldn't waste time on
right, because then he talks to him. He says, basically like Dr. Bowman says something like, "What's the problem?" And Hal is like, "Well, I think you and I both know the answer to that." And I read your lips, and he has this sort of self-indulgent moment of like the evil genius like revealing his plan. It's like, "Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave." And it's like, he ends that conversation by saying something like, "This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye." And it's like, well, what purpose did that conversation serve, if not to stroke your ego? But then it's contrasted by Dr. Bowman's silence when he decides what to do. He says like, "Okay, fine, I'm going to go through the emergency airlock." Hal, says, "You're going to find that hard to do without your helmet." But then basically Dave stops talking to him. And he gets silent, and he just does what he needs to do. And even when he gets onto the ship, and now Hal is kind of badgering him, what do you think you're doing? I'm feeling better now. Like, don't do that. Stop. Dr. Bowman says nothing. And Hal even says, "I can see that you're very upset about this," but it's obvious actually that he's not. He's totally calm.
I don't know. I think that there is a sense that, I don't know if it's fear that Hal might do something more to him before he can disable him, but there is, at least once he starts disconnecting Hal, he's breathing faster, and the way that when Hal offers to sing the song, he sort of says, "Yes, do that," in a kind of almost a consoling way. He seems to be, have some discomfort with that he's actually killing Hal. Whether or not he thinks rationally that this is actually like a person, he seems to be, I don't know. I get a sense, why do you think he says, "Yeah, let's hear that song"? It almost seems like, like he's trying to give Hal some occupation,
right,
some consolation as he dies or something.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know. I think that's probably as good an explanation as any.
So what do you think, what's the role of this Hal subplot in the larger themes of the film? Obviously, like human evolution, there's like two possible directions for it, right? One being artificial intelligence and the other being whatever the heck happens at the end.
I think that this film really is like a triumph of the human spirit. Or I think that's what we're seeing, opaqueness of the ending notwithstanding. I think it begins with the dawn of man, and then it's very much a human-centric film, and then we see, I think, in this sort of confrontation between Hal and Dr. Bowman, the triumph of sort of human intuition and ingenuity and manual override over robots. I think I found myself thinking like, see, this is why it's so important to have manual overrides, like just as a matter of principle. I really bristle at the seatbelt beeping indicators that tell you when your seatbelt's off in a car. Not that I think that seatbelts are a bad thing. I totally think they're great. I think everybody should wear seatbelts. But I think that at the end of the day, I should choose to wear a seatbelt or not and not be badgered into it by my car, like my thing that I own. So fine, yeah, maybe beep to remind me that I don't have my seatbelt on. But once you've reminded me, you've served your purpose. I don't need you to keep beeping at me. So a lot of cars, you can't even override this. You can't get it to shut up. It just, the only way to get it to shut up is to comply and to put on your seatbelt. And I think that just as a matter of principle,
with me, James?
Thomas, as a matter of principle,
do I detect some anger in your voice, James? I hope I haven't done anything to upset you.
It just needs to be rejected out of hand,
I'm trying to talk to you like I'm your car.
Yeah, well, thanks be to God, my car does shut up after it's like, I've counted it. It's like after like 182 beeps or something, it finally stops. And you better believe that sometimes I just defy it out of spite. But yeah, I found myself thinking in this film, like, okay, yes, thank God that there are actually ways for David Bowman to accomplish things manually without depending on Hal. Because if he had to depend on Hal for these things, it would be bad.
Going back to the reasons you adopted this sort of Catholic feminist label for a while, one of the reasons you said in the post was that you thought it was an important way of finding common ground with secular feminists. And how did that work out?
It didn't work out at all. So the way that I like to find common ground with other women who are struggling with this issue is to say that, I defend the rights of all women, regardless of their age, location, gender, health, or wantedness. And so when I had readopted this feminist label, I kind of thought that was like the way we could find common ground. I'd say, well, I'm a feminist too, and I defend the rights of all women. But the problem with that is that it really didn't make women more kindly disposed towards me at all, because they just became defensive. They didn't understand. They saw me as like a traitor to feminism, because feminism is pretty specifically a type of political activism, and I wasn't really speaking their language. So the terminology ended up being kind of a greater obstacle to their openness. And I found that leaving it behind, just saying what I wanted to say without using the term feminist was much more effective. So I would say, like, I applaud your commitment to defending the rights of women. We share that passion. And I could say we share that passion without calling myself a feminist. Let's talk about the rights of all women, regardless of age, location, gender, health, or wantedness. And I just find it was much easier to have a conversation that way. And they didn't get very defensive, because they didn't see me as misusing their identity, because it really is an identity, not just a term. And also, one real problem with using the term feminist, like I said, it is a political term. And people would automatically, if you say I'm a feminist, they want to lump you into everything from, abortion to paternity leave. It's just such a huge variety of social issues. They tend to all be lumped together. They tend to be, leftist or liberal. And I didn't necessarily agree with those. So I broke it down, made it simple. I love all women and I oppose injustice.
It's funny that you said in the article that it was only the other Catholics who thought your adoption of the term was cool.
Yeah. Yes. The secular feminists were not happy with me.
I honestly think a lot of young Catholics kind of dabble in, whatever kind of leftist cause you might want to name. They grew up perhaps in a sheltered kind of Catholic environment, and something that they see as kind of stuffy, and they want a Catholicism that seems to have more vitality to it and more kind of like going to the peripheries-ness to it. And so they kind of dabble in these secular ideologies without kind of realizing how spiritually poisonous they are.
I completely agree with you.
But what's interesting is that it also often seems to bring other things along with it. So some of the Catholic feminists I know personally here in New York seem to have adopted a lot of other aspects of sort of secular identity politics, whether it's with regard to race or, having their preferred pronoun on their Twitter profile,
Mm-hmm.
She, her, or something like that. And it's just interesting how it always seems to bring along a lot of other stupidity. Even some of it isn't explicitly contrary to church teaching, but just a lot of the kind of corresponding identity politics type movements in other areas.
It almost seems inevitable. And even just watching people go through their journey because, the internet exposes that. And so if you follow somebody for long enough, you see the different changes in their lives, especially with younger people who just haven't lived as much of life yet and who just are experiencing the changes and waves of life, but they're doing it all publicly. And you're right, the direction that it heads in seem to be the same. I mean, it might go slower for some people or quicker for other people. But if somebody clings to the label and identifies that way, it almost seems inevitable that they end up aligning themselves with these other principles and just, political projects. Well, the perfect example in my life is my husband. And he's a strong man. He has always had a strong personality, very loving, but not weak, not in the way that, I guess, for example, there were times when I was arguing a feminist position or a non-Catholic or non-Christian position, and we would go back and forth. And he was charitable, he was loving, he was respectful, but he never backed down from the truth. He never backed down from he just wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid to be who he was. And I think that was very appealing, just on a natural level. Women like men who act like men. And because he did it in a Christ-centered way, because he was loving, because he was respectful and gave me the time to talk and we had exchanges, it was so productive. And so I think adopting a Christ attitude towards everybody in our lives for a young man, I think he just needs to be that. He needs to be strong with the gentleness of Christ, the strength of Christ, the gentleness of Christ, and not compromising. And I think ultimately that is, a feminist inclined female is going to be upset by that. But ultimately, she will find that it draws her in and highlights the things about femininity, which are beautiful, makes her feel beautiful, respected, loved, leads her really to the heart of Christ. And so it's a vague answer because every situation is totally different. But I think we need men who really, truly have a relationship with Christ, who know him and who are committed to serving him. And I think that comes out very naturally under those circumstances.
That's a great answer. And I think, fear of human respect plays into this so much, and much more than, sincere belief. Often, I think when people, especially Catholics, start adopting some of these kind of positions from secular ideologies, at least on the part of men, I think some of them may be confused and really think they have to adopt this ideology to be a good person or something like that. But
Right.
I think, it's important to talk about fear of human respect and also, the fact that it unmans you.
Does.
It does. The fact that if you are unable to deal with making your female friends mad at you for a minute, then that's not manly at all.
And I think that actually contributes to this disdain that women have for men. I don't think women actually admire that in a man.
Yeah. And also, men shouldn't sort of sit back and hide and complain, because if men are kind of the leaders in society, then they have a responsibility to take a stand, not in a kind of a brutal way, but they need to be authentically who they are, as you said, and not sort of blame it on women. Because if men aren't being men, then and men are the ones who are supposed to take the initiative, then women are not going to be able to be women either.
Right. There's no freedom there. And that's where that grasp for control comes from too, with the feminist ideology. I think there's so much there. Like, I don't hate feminists. I completely understand it. I was there. And one thing that I've seen over and over again is that many of the most diehard feminists have been deeply, deeply wounded by men. And,
Absolutely.
they're trying to reconcile and heal and all of those things. And it grows from that seed, you know? And so we're obligated, all of us, to look at each other and find ways to be of service and to help heal. And that is just incredibly difficult. But there's a very real anger and hatred towards men. The best I can say is that, they want men to fit into a role that they think serves them, but ultimately doesn't. And feminism does not protect anyone. It's millions of individuals walking around in armor and swords, angry and afraid of being hurt, and angry and afraid of having someone take things away from them. And it's just a terrible way to live. And the gospel way to live, it's imperfect because we're imperfect, and it can be messy, but it's this integrated community of respect and love. And that's where our answer needs to come from.
What is the West? My proposal is that there are 6, I call them variously canons, insights, general propositions that the Western tradition considers foundational. And there are all kinds of different accounts or disputes within these 6 big points. But these are the 6 things that are just, as it were, taken on as assumptions. And so within whose framework everything else gets worked out. Everything else becomes, as it were, a footnote to Christian Platonism. So Christian Platonism proposes 6 things. 1, that man is an intellectual animal. Man is, by nature, has the capacity to know the truth. And he has the capacity to know the truth because in virtue of his spiritual or non-material intellect, he's able to enter into intellectual or spiritual relationship with all other beings. That's what it means to have an intellect. A chair is just a chair. It has the form of chair. It doesn't and can't be anything else without having that form destroyed and another one imposed upon it. The mind of every intellectual being, is one that's capable of receiving other forms without having its own form vitiated or destroyed. And so it's in virtue of our having an intellect that we're capable of entering into relationship with other things. In consequence, man's nature is founded on a prior or foundational intelligibility in the world, and he's intellectually and erotically oriented toward a transcendent knowledge of it. That is to say, we know things, and our reason operates on the assumption of first principles that are already in us, but which we didn't have to discover for ourselves before we could start reasoning. This is where a lot of modern thinking goes awry, assumes you have to prove first principles before you can say you know anything. Well, you can't know something without knowing it. So it would seem that we're already in the act of knowing. One of the things that we do, however, upon reflection, is to dig down and see that the only reason we can know the truth about things, the only thing we can perform acts of reasoning, is because we've already received as a gift, as an inborn reality, the principles of the intellect that allow it to do what it does. And further, we see that from those first principles, through the long journey or pilgrimage of our reasoning, that we're clearly striving towards something. The intellect has a good proper to itself, as Dante would tell us. The good of the intellect is truth. And a full vision of truth is something, in a manner of speaking, that's more than the truth. What is that? Well, my third principle is this dual orientation, intellectual and erotic orientation towards a transcendent knowledge of reality. This dual orientation proceeds by way of reason towards an intellectual vision perceptive of beauty itself, with a capital B, which is the splendor of truth. The most ancient definition in the Western tradition of beauty is, well, in Latin, veritas splendor, the splendor of truth. A truth is a form, an essential appearance where you say, now I see it. But no one truth, however small, is merely itself. If I have the number 1, for instance, as soon as I know what the number 1 is, I'm launched on an adventure of discovering the number 1's relationship to other numbers and to plus and minus and multiplication. That is to say, every truth exists in itself. It has its own form or essence, to use the ancient language that I think actually is the most adequate language. And by being itself, it stands in a definite relationship to perhaps an infinity of other truths, other realities, so that finally the truth as a whole is one. When we perceive truth as a whole as one, we see that everything we know stands in splendorous relationship with everything else. Just as the way that the sun sends out its rays and communicates its warmth and its light to everything else that is, so the Christian Platonist tradition proposes to us that reality is that way. That reality is created by God, and that God communicates and therefore puts himself into relationship with everything else that exists. And everything else that exists, therefore, stands not only in relationship with God, but to everything else. And so that idea of radiance or claritas or splendor coming out of things is in fact that sense that we already have or that we perceive of things standing in intelligible relationship to each other. Now, here's the big argument. What I'm proposing, therefore, is that truth, the truth about things, is in itself intrinsically beautiful. And I want to go farther. It has to be beautiful. And it's only because the truth is beautiful. It's only because beauty is veritas splendor, the splendor of truth, that we understand why it is that we want to know the truth in the first place. There are plenty of people who think they only want to know the truth because they're trying to get ahead in the world. They want to know just enough truth to figure out how to be a good accountant or how to be a good used car salesman or, how to conquer a small country. Most people have a sort of shriveled rationalistic vision of their destiny. But in fact, we want to know the truth because when we see the truth whole, we attain wisdom. And the state of contemplation that is made possible by the achievement of wisdom is not simply a good in itself. It's the good. It's the thing we desire more than anything. What we really desire, of course, is to know all things in their relationship to the one who made them. And so the fourth insight is that the world as a whole is itself ordered by and to duty. The world is made by God and ordered to God, and not God in some bare unknowing way, but God in this fullness of his radiance that causes things to be and that calls things back to know him and to stand in loving relationship with him through that knowledge. So God is the divine beauty, but also God as the cause of every earthly beauty that causes all things to hold or inhere as a intelligible whole. So that fourth point speaks primarily about the nature of reality as a whole. The fifth one turns to us. That human dignity specifically consists in our capacity to perceive and contemplate that splendorous order. And thus the most excellent form of human life is that which is given over to such contemplation. This is, in a sense, will sound kind of controversial. Most people will say many people will say that the most excellent form of life is some kind of action in the world. But I think we all know that that's not true, precisely because we all know that knowing has to be involved in the purpose of our lives. If we stand before truth and contemplate it, nobody's going to say, why would you want to do that? It's the one true end in itself. I think back to the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle gives a wonderful demonstration that the contemplative life is the good life for man. And I love the kind of the rhetoric of his demonstration of the truth, because he says, for instance, nobody would fight a war for its own sake, right? So attaining glory in war can't be a good in itself. It has to be only a useful good, because we wouldn't want to fight war for its own sake. We would want to fight a war so as to secure peace so that we can then live peacefully and do something else. I'm sure everybody who listened to him that day nodded approvingly because they were too embarrassed to say, actually, gosh, I don't know. I kind of thought fighting a war was a good in itself because by fighting in a war, I could show my courage. And by showing my courage, even if I die, I could be viewed as glorious. And that glory would make me an immortal, someone who would be remembered down through history for decades, centuries, perhaps forever. Aristotle says, no, this is not the case. Because, of course, if glory were the end, we would have an incoherence. Something that's not really good in itself would be being treated as good in itself. Why isn't glory good in itself? Well, glory, as Aristotle's contemporaries understood it, was simply a splendor or an effulgence that came from having done something good, fought well in a battle. The glory itself, therefore, was just a sort of fruit, but it wasn't a real end. How do we know that? Well, imagine somebody had unearned glory. Nobody wants to be undeserving of glory. Nobody really wants to be, in contemporary terms, a mere celebrity, where everyone looks at you in your glory and then looks at you a little more closely and realizes that you have not one virtue proper to yourself that's actually worthy of admiration. Hence, I think the self-destructiveness of so many celebrity lives is that they're forced constantly to reckon with the emptiness of their own success. So the only success that doesn't abandon us in the end is the success of standing in contemplation of the truth in all of its beauty. This is the most excellent form of human life. But then we say, what is that? Why should that be so good? And so the sixth insight tells us this contemplation realizes itself in what we may call happiness or salvation. And it is characterized by an activity that resembles passivity. That is to say, not simply the absence of motion, but a fullness of activity that's called peace and freedom. What I was trying to get at with this insight is that so much of our lives is spent feeling that we're either passive, we're being acted upon, mere employees or functionaries or servants, or we reach out and seize activity. We're the ones who act upon others. We're bosses or commanders or executives. But we see that neither of these positions is ever final, right? I might be the boss of my children until my wife tells me to do something else. I go from being the active to the passive person. These are very partial positions that are never fully expressive of who we are. And they're also very partial in the sense that they're not everlasting. What we're really striving for is a condition of happiness where we say, yes, here I have arrived. I need not go anywhere else because what I have found here is infinitely good, so that it can never be surpassed because it is itself unsurpassingly good. And so we have to understand that not in terms of the question, what next? Because there is no next. How would you get beyond what's infinitely good? Well, yeah, but what are you going to do after that? Well, Socrates tells us happiness is the possession of the good forever. So there is no after. It's everlasting. It's only in this act of contemplation that we transcend all those partial positions of activity and passivity and become simply fulfilled, filled up in such a way with what is good that there's no further good that we have to go chasing. If we don't have this sixth position, there are a number of things that we can never understand, including we can't understand how life could actually be purposeful, how life is not just a succession of, in the long term, meaningless pursuits of this good or that good or this good or that good, but is rather life is one pilgrimage, one quest to find our destiny, to be fulfilled, and to stand within that fulfillment ever after.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.